So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. And for those of you who have attended our series before, welcome back. I'm Dr. Megan Wong, a lecturer at the School of Law here at the University of Essex, where I'm also the founding director of the LLM in International Law degree and the co-founder and co-convener together with Dr. Emily Jones of this series. I am delighted to be your host for today's event with our speaker, Professor Gina Heathcote, which will be chaired by Dr. Emily Jones, and I will defer to Dr. Jones, our chair, to introduce our excellent speaker today. Right now, in my role of host, I wanted to speak a little bit more about the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. So this year, our lecture series was opened by Professor Pierre-Marie Dupuy on the universality of public international law in the year 2021 and in the years to come. And today we are very pleased to have with us today Professor Heathcote's lecture entitled Women, Peace, and Maritime Security. Just a little bit about our series before we start. The Essex Public International Law Lecture Series is built upon two important intellectual traditions of public international law: formalism and international legal practice, international legal theory, including post-colonial and feminist perspectives. The idea for the series stems very much first and foremost from our friendship between Dr. Jones and I, and is inspired from our respect for each other's scholarship and research. We're both generalist public international lawyers with several specialist interests, including our mutual interests in international law of the sea, international environmental law, the law on the use of force, but we write from different approaches. I am a formalist and Dr. Jones is a critical legal scholar, and we are thinking that this series brings together what we hope is something for everyone. And let me now introduce our excellent chair for today's event. Dr. Emily Jones is first and foremost my friend, my colleague, my co-founder and co-convener of this excellent series. She is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Essex. She's a generalist public international lawyer specializing in gender and international law, science and technology and international law, and international environmental law. Dr. Jones recently published a co-authored book with Zed entitled The Law of War and Peace, a Gender Analysis, Volume 1, and her monograph, Feminist Theory and International Law, Post-Human Perspectives, is forthcoming with Routledge's Glasshouse series, something that we can all look forward to. And now, Dr. Jones, if you would like to commence our event for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. It is, of course, a pleasure, as always, to be here with you today. And of course, I am very, very proud to be your chair for this evening for Professor Gina Heathcote's lecture. It goes without saying that Professor Heathcote's work has long inspired my own, and she's also been a brilliant mentor of mine for many years. So I'm particularly proud to be here with her today. And it's really a joy to have her join us for the Essex Public International Law Lecture Series. But to introduce our speaker properly and more formally, Professor Gina Heathcote is a professor of gender studies and international law at the SOAS School of Law, Gender and Media. Professor Heathcote writes on feminist methodologies, collective security and international law, and is currently working on a book which is to be titled International Law of the Sea, a Feminist Analysis. So one to look out for there too. Her most recent publications include a chapter in Johnston and Ratner's collection, which is called Talking International Law, and Professor Heathcote's publication there is entitled Protesting the Preamble, Normative Pronouncements and Feminist Jurisprudence in the Security Council. She's also written an entry for the Oxford Bibliography of International Law on gender and security, and has a forthcoming article coming out with the London Review of International Law on maritime demarcations in the Gulf. Professor Heathcote is, of course, also the author of Feminist Dialogues on International Law, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2019, and The Law of the Use of Force, a Feminist Analysis, which came out with Routledge in 2012. And of course, she co-authored, along with myself, Sarah Bototti and Sherry Lebensky, The Law of War and Peace, A Gender Analysis, Volume 1, which came out with Bloomsbury earlier this year. So Professor Heathcote will be speaking today to the title of Women, Peace and Maritime Security. Just a couple of quick housekeeping rules for you all. If you do want to ask a question, there is a kind of Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please use that to ask your questions. You can choose to remain anonymous. So when you're asking your question, there's a kind of drop-down box and you can click to remain anonymous. So if you want to be anonymous, then please do that. And if you don't do that, then I may well read out your name. So that is all from me. Without further ado, Professor Heathcote, welcome and over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and for Megan for that lovely welcome. What a pleasure it is to be here and join you, albeit virtually, at the Essex Law School. I do look forward to a time when we might meet and discuss the ideas here today in person again, and also the kind of larger ideas that you've brought through this series. It's such a fascinating and important series on international law, and I love the way you frame the series, so thank you for inviting me. My topic today presents a bit of a foray into a new area of research for me, while at the same time building on some of the ideas that I have previously developed around the Women, Peace and Security agenda and on feminist approaches to first collective security and also the international law of the sea. And of course, the work that I have done on the international law of the sea is inspired by and influenced by the work of Irini Papanikolapoulou, whose amazing book, Gender and the Law of the Sea, really instigated, sorry, I'll hold it properly, instigated my interest in this field and has inspired a host of conversations, both with Irini and other colleagues. You know, if you haven't read that book, which has now won a prize as well, do get your hands on it. It's really influenced kind of tweaked my interest in thinking about what a feminist approach to the law of the sea might look like. However, today I want to narrow my focus to think just around the issue of maritime security, and it made sense for me to then think about that in the context of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and framework. So to take you through my ideas, emergent as they are, and I welcome your comments and thoughts on the topic towards the end of the lecture, is to first just give a little grounding on what Women, Peace and Security is and what I'm referring to with that. And then progress to talk about maritime security before bringing the two together. And my kind of approach is to think about how maritime security might afford a lens to think differently about women, peace and security, and to do the reverse and think about how women, peace and security might provide a lens for us to think differently about maritime security. I'll also introduce the feminist approaches that I am kind of applying and thinking through in this report, this research. So I don't think of feminist approaches as singular. I write elsewhere about feminist approaches being plural, and in particular for this project, I'm thinking about the mobilization and the deployment of post-colonial and post-human feminisms as a mechanism to think differently about these two areas. And in doing that, I will talk about the Maritime Task Force in Lebanon under the UNIFIL peacekeeping mission. I'll talk about counterterrorism and piracy, and thinking also finally about the ocean as an international legal subject. I argue that feminist analysis brings to the international law of the sea new maps of the ocean that speak to the colonial histories of international legal encounters on the oceans, and simultaneously the ominous futures of climate change, ocean acidification, and rising sea levels. My analysis demonstrates the risks of either ignoring maritime security within the Women, Peace and Security framework, or approaching women, peace and maritime security through the existing approaches as the kind of early trends where we have seen some crossover between the two regimes seem to indicate. So to start that conversation, I am just going to do a little bit of an introduction to women, peace and security. And while I do that, I'm going to share my slides just to give, to make sure, you know, we're all got the same kind of background knowledge that I will be referring to as we go through the talk. So women, peace and security. Women, peace and security starts or commences with the issuing of Security Council Resolution 1325 in the year 2000. Of course, feminist work on peace and security precedes this moment in 2000 and expands in both institutional and non-institutional space as well before this, not least through the wonderful work of Women's League for International Peace and Freedom, WILF. But for the purposes of international law and collective security, it is the creation of Security Council Resolution 1325 that marks an important moment when the Security Council acknowledges the need to account for and respond to women's experiences of armed conflict. Indeed, my colleague Diane Otto writes that 1325 was the first time the Security Council formally recognized that women may be something other than victims of armed conflict who need its protection. And there were moments, there were a couple of resolutions prior to this where the Council had mentioned women, including in the resolution establishing the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in 1999 in response to Taliban atrocities in Afghanistan, just in the preamble. And in those resolutions, there was just a mention of women as being victims and not a kind of wider understanding of women, peace and security. So 1325 kind of marks that shift. Since the creation of Resolution 1325 in the year 2000, the Council has embedded women, peace and security within its programme of work. This was slow at first, and in fact, the second resolution wasn't issued on women, peace and security, was not issued until 2008. It was then followed by two more resolutions in 2009, a single resolution in 2010, and two further in 2013. This takes us to about 2015, when the Council initiates a review of the 15 years of the Women, Peace and Security framework, and at the end of that review issues Resolution 2242. Now, since then, there have been two more resolutions specifically on women, peace and security, Resolution 2467 from 2019, and a second 2019 Resolution 2493, adding altogether for 10 resolutions on women, peace and security issued by the Council over the last 21 years. There have also been additional resolutions that speak to topics such as sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping in 2016, and a resolution on human trafficking also in 2016. A further review was undertaken in 2020 to mark the 20-year anniversary of 1325, but no resolution was issued. And it's after these 2019 resolutions into the kind of current period that we see some opposition to some components of the development of WPS from the permanent members of the Security Council, particularly around the framing of sexual and reproductive health. Now, in addition to these broad, what we call thematic resolutions of the Security Council, women, peace and security agendas emerge within what we would call situation-specific resolutions of the Council. So resolutions responding to specific conflicts or situations. And in addition, states are required, and many have, to create national action plans on women, peace and security. Across those agendas, we see primarily the travelling of women, peace and security provisions on the protection of women and children, the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, the prosecution of gender-based violence and gender-based crimes in armed conflict, and calls for the increased participation of women in decision-making bodies and peacekeeping operations, as well as the appointment of gender experts and women, peace and security, women protection advisors. But nevertheless, despite these transformations, the women, peace and security resolutions are classified as non-binding or chapter 6 resolutions. So we need, one of the things that's of interest to me is what is the power of those resolutions? 10 resolutions, multiple kind of recountings of some of the provisions of the resolutions in specific country-specific resolutions, or what we might call situation-specific ones. There is this large corpus of resolutions and a framework of law that has increasing importance on our understandings of collective security. In fact, Christine Chinkin and Madeleine Rees talk about and write about the legal value of Security Council Resolution 2467 from 2019, and suggests that careful interpretation of 2467, read in conjunction with the earlier women, peace and security resolutions, which of course have not been rescinded, and existing international law allows for the assertion of state legal obligations and corresponding individual rights. So we see women, peace and security as a series of repeating and evolving demands that seems to shift them from just being a series of thematic resolutions by the council and towards a series of legal ambiguities. Legal obligations. And of course, this is even more so for the provisions that are held within situation-specific resolutions. So I just want to draw attention to one particular phrase that comes from Resolution 2242 from 2015. And it's written on the slide there for you to follow. And it's in this resolution in paragraph 5A that the council commits to facilitating a more systematic approach to women, peace and security within its own work and enable greater oversight and coordination of implementation efforts. I think this is quite important, and I'll return to this idea of a systematic approach to women, peace and security within the Security Council's work after I define maritime security in a moment. I want to note also too the importance of a current development within the Council, where this year we didn't see a new Women, Peace and Security resolution issued after the annual debate, which usually happens in October. But what we did see was the creation of a tri-presidency on women, peace and security, which signaled a focus on the development of women, peace and security across the various situation-specific resolutions going forward. So the tri-presidency saw Ireland, Kenya and Mexico committing, as they hold the presidency in succession across the end of this year, to addressing gender across situations during their individual periods as presidents of the Security Council, allowing for new debates and discussions, including in the current month of November, the first ever open debate in the Security Council on widows in conflict and post-conflict settings. I think that there is some importance to the tri-presidency model for a cooperative approach to Security Council practice going forward. And I think it is important that this has emerged at a moment when permanent members of the Council have been stalled on action specifically with the issue of women, peace and security. I'll come back to that, but what I want to talk through next is the idea of maritime security and what's held and contained in the idea of maritime security. Now, maritime security might traditionally be understood through the identification of what constitutes a threat to maritime security. And this has also traditionally been done through identifying, in fact, threats to the state that start in maritime territories. For example, an early definition given of maritime security describes it as the protection of a state's land and maritime security, infrastructure, economy, and environment and society from harmful acts originating at sea. So the centering of state security in this definition has come to be over time challenged by contemporary understandings of human security that encompass the increased recognition of a need for a comprehensive response to human rights abuses, including at sea and maritime dimensions of environmental issues. So this shift from state security agendas within the maritime space towards thinking about maritime security through the lens of human security is kind of the space where we're at now. Now, in terms of thinking about institutional developments on collective security and maritime security, the Secretary General, in his report titled Oceans and the Law of the Sea 2008, addresses the issue of maritime security through the lens of human security, identifying that threats go well beyond the use of force and extend to poverty, infectious disease, environmental degradation, internal conflicts, the spread and possible use of biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, terrorism, and transnational crime. This conception of human security is then framed as driving a greater need for cooperation on issues of maritime security. The Secretary General in the Oceans and the Law of the Sea report identifies and elaborates on 7 specific types of threats to maritime security, including piracy and armed robbery at sea, terrorist acts at sea, illicit trafficking in weapons and arms, illicit trafficking in drugs and psychotropic substances, illicit trafficking and smuggling of persons at sea, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and unlawful damage to the environment, marine environment. So this focus and development of human security becomes quite important. And in one of the rare pieces of literature that actually engages the issue of women, peace and security, or at least gender perspectives and human security, Lirola Delgado identifies that the absence of gender perspective in state-defined perceptions of maritime security would benefit from states and other units. In particular, her work speaks to the European Union's maritime security strategy, would all benefit from a shift to human security and associates this with an incorporation of gender perspectives. In a different space, and also included on the slide, we see the African Union's Lome Charter from 2006, which defines maritime security differently again. And here, the maritime security is defined as the prevention of and fight against all acts or threats for illicit acts against a ship, its crew and its passengers, or against the port facilities, maritime infrastructure, maritime facilities, and maritime environment. This incorporation of economic, environmental, and human security is also kind of pitched around the idea of cooperation for African states to ameliorate threats that suffer. But unfortunately, the Charter itself suffers from an insufficient number of ratifications, despite it being 5 years since it was first opened for signature. Importantly, the Lome Convention frames maritime security through threats to maritime objects, ships, ports, the environment, rather than states. And perhaps this also explains the low ratification rates. At the moment, 2 out of the necessary 15 ratifications have occurred. But I want to argue it also offers a move towards a post-human law, and I'm going to come back to that. The Security Council's own engagement with the idea of maritime security has been rather piecemeal and fragmented. In fact, it usually emerges through larger agendas and other situations already on the Security Council's agenda, rather than any coordinated framework. Therefore, it is significant that in August of this year, the Council held its first open debate on maritime security, engaging across the various issues and situations towards developing a coordinated response. Prior to this, the Council, the issue of maritime security had emerged under specific discussions, such as the ones I identified in the Secretary General's report before. And the Council had also addressed issues of piracy, and specifically in relation to Somalia, where you may or may not know there is an authorization of military force in the territorial waters of Somalia to challenge the threat of piracy or combat piracy in the area. The Council in 2011 addressed the issue of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea and subsequently acknowledged this as a threat, that the threat of piracy and armed robbery at sea in the Gulf of Guinea poses a threat to international peace and security. The Council has also responded to maritime crime in the Mediterranean region, and in June 2018 conducted an open debate on maritime crime as a threat to international peace and security. Maritime crime also arises in the context of the Council's discussions on peace and security in Africa, with a specific focus on drug trafficking at sea, and has been on the Council's agenda since 2010. In 2018, the Council hosted a debate on drug trafficking in West Africa as a threat to stability, and looked at maritime access and crime. And then in 2019, the Council held an Araya Formula meeting on transnational organized crime and drug trafficking as a threat to international stability, with a particular focus on the Caribbean region. Again, speaking to maritime components of this. But it's in this coming together of these issues in August 2021 when the Council commenced a process of drawing together this range of issues that had previously been fragmented across these numbers of agendas, and sometimes only part of a different situational discussion. And although the debate this year did not produce a resolution, the Council did endorse a presidential statement. And this is the one on the slide, where the statement encourages member states to continue building and strengthening their capacities to enhance maritime safety and security, including against piracy, armed robbery at sea, and terrorist activities, as well as all forms of transnational organized crime and other illicit activities in the maritime domain. So in my work, I want to think about what a feminist analysis and perhaps potentially the women, peace and security agenda might bring to this. I want to analyze both some of the specific components of maritime security as it emerges within the Council, in particular, the UN peacekeeping operation in Lebanon, authorized via Resolution 1707, operating as UNIFIL, and think through actually where women, peace and security does emerge in those mandates. But my own approach as a plural feminist approach to law, I want to think through what other kind of ways we might come to talk about maritime security. I want to think about moving from human security to post-human security, and think about how environmental security, women, peace and security, and maritime security might offer a moment through drawing on post-colonial and post-human feminisms, mechanism for shifting all of these three fields. So let me talk to and about my kind of understanding of both post-colonial and post-human feminisms in my approach and as a methodology. So post-colonial feminist approaches to the maintenance of international peace and security require the development of a feminist genealogy that renders visible the feminist knowledge, the role of feminist knowledge in the civilizing discourses of colonialism, and an understanding of the legal transplants that persist and circulate globally long after decolonizing processes. Now, for drawing on the work of Vasuki Nesai, this means developing an understanding of how mainstream feminist approaches within international law often pitch non-Western women into debates on culture, on difference, on religion, on sexuality, and on violence that silence the very possibility of alternative feminist traditions and knowledge outside of the frames of Western feminisms. And this entails attention to how legal knowledge encodes specific knowledge histories, including feminist histories, to reproduce existing power structures that align with existing race and gendered privileges. So I want to think through the potential of using post-colonial feminist knowledge and methodologies to at once think about the potential and the risks of the women, peace and security agenda to reinforce specific frames and modes of operating within international law, and think through drawing in and on post-colonial, post-human feminists, whether there is also a space to undo that. In drawing on post-human feminisms, I incorporate feminist critiques and understandings and theorizings of the relationship between non-human life forms and human encounters. shifting away from humanist perceptions of academic traditions that center human knowledge as distinct from nature. Bradotti describes this as an emphasis on social, transspecies, and the transnational. And the emergence, I want to think through particularly post-human feminists that respond to the issue of water, and in our case, the ocean, and the emergence of a specifically watery imagination of the post-human relations recalls water as humans as watery, and the earth as watery, and retells our approaches to law and to life and our lived experiences through liquid frames and the trans-species dependencies that are never contained to land. For Probyn, this is to understand through human and non-human digestion the ocean's expulsions of human excess. For Nominus, this is a phenomenology of bodies of water, of bodies as water as bodies, that reframes the human's anticipated encounter with the self to find herself not so distinct from water, such that water is human matter. Elsewhere, Nominus, like Bradotti, explores the convergence of the Anthropocene and raced, classed, and gendered bodies to consider a need for post-human feminisms that examine how whiteness is drawn into the maintenance of the nature-culture dualism. The complex nature-culture imaginaries that emerge understand the mechanisms through which humans are always in the ocean and the ocean in humans, in terms of biological dependencies, creative frames, philosophical, political, and legal understandings, and human, non-human encounters, while holding present the violence of slavery that the ocean holds in, following Christina Sharp's work, The Wake. So this might seem a bit unusual, an unusual frame to bring to international law, to think about our watery dependencies. But of course, if we see the ocean and the risks to the ocean at this moment in time, as well as our watery selves, then perhaps we might also think about our approaches to the ocean differently. So here I want to think about how these various texts offer a way of seeing and arriving at the ocean, no longer premised on terra firma as a starting point, or the ocean as outside of the human sphere of reference, such that the blue spaces on political and legal maps are not voids to be filled, but extensions of humans. This raises a challenge to legal subjectivity that first places humans on land, and second constructs a normative universe that considers the ocean as a second thought and as other. I consider what an approach to women, peace and security and maritime might look like if feminist posthumanism commits to understanding the embedded lives of human within non-human environments, and their relational frames inform our perceptions of what constitutes a threat to security. So this is the kind of methodology that I want to take back to the law and think through with you to think about the specific spaces of maritime security. And I guess ask whether women, peace and security is the space to do that. Now, I don't want to suggest that women, peace and security has not doesn't kind of appear at all within maritime security. In fact, within the national action plans of states with large naval forces in particular, we do see a recognition and an application of women, peace and security. And there are some United Nations maritime initiatives that center on women, peace and security. For example, the civil society organization, One Earth Futures, together with the International Maritime Organization and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, hosted in 2018 an event which assessed the relevance of women, peace and security to maritime security, and promoted particularly the agenda of Resolution 1325. And in that report, in that event, the kind of confluence of women, peace and security and maritime security was described as follows. Women contribute directly to coastal stability while playing important roles in solutions to maritime crime. Women's income goes directly to feeding their families and benefiting communities at a greater rate than men's. Women strongly influence behavior and decision-making in their families and communities, and this role can be wielded to create positive change and prevent participation in criminal activity such as piracy. Increases in gender equality contribute to more sustainable peace. Women's participation in peace agreements increases by more than a third the likelihood of that agreement having lasting impact. Inversely, gender inequality is associated with increased corruption and violence. Gender inequality may also amplify grievances and around resource allocation, thereby increasing maritime insecurity. In other spaces, such as the Halifax Peace with Women Fellowship Program, a space for bringing together female leaders within NATO, has always included also Navy and Coast Guard senior officers. So to recognize women's and enhance women's leadership in NATO, and has obviously included women working in maritime spaces. These initiatives indicate the sole space where women, peace and security has emerged within the larger frames of maritime security, with the exception of the UNIFIL authorizations, which I'm going to speak to in a moment. Yet each of these claims relies on existing liberal feminist approaches of increasing women's access to decision-making within military and other key decision-making structures. And it's not clear how much that actually has had any influence on navies or Coast Guard communities. And in addition, there is an uptake of a narrow approach to women, peace and securities within the first quote that I gave you. Women are seen as potential conduits for influencing future generations and the men in their communities, or are given a social reproduction role, perceived to be the role of women as wives and mothers. Women's association with peace and the narrow reassertion of the gender binary that emerges through the production of war and peace is replete within this approach. And the reduction of gender equality, not as a social good in and of its own, but as an instrument towards the amplification of grievances around resource allocation, also seems to be the way for justifying a women, peace and security agenda around maritime security. And I want to argue that this actually is an impoverished approach, although it might be an important foothold to starting conversations. Taking a feminist analysis, perhaps we might want to think beyond repeating and only a kind of affirming a narrow and in some ways very gendered approach to women, peace and security, which sees women as instruments for influencing men's behavior, so women always in relation to men, or gender inequality as something that might help us secure peace and not actually something that's just good in its own configuration. So I want to think too about the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, which includes as part of its mandate a maritime task force. So I'm not going to go into the whole details of the mandate, but which was first established in 1978 after the Israeli invasion, and then subsequently strengthened in 2006 after the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, and it's at this point the Maritime Task Force is created. More recently, the current mandate for the Maritime Task Force includes the enlargement of a European command of the task force. And I want to question the larger agenda of the European states in choosing to supply troops, naval vessels, and command structures to maritime security in Lebanon. Now, of course, this is couched through the language of peacekeeping and the conflict in the region. But I think if we parallel the interest of Europe with its border security regimes, and we might think to particularly the role that Europe has played in the training of Libyan Coast Guard forces, questions might be raised. In fact, in the most recent resolution, the Council articulates a need for handing over the Maritime Task Force's duties to the Lebanese Armed Forces. So the interest of Europe at this moment seems to replicate not only other roles that the European Union has taken in training Coast Guard and maritime forces in the wider region, with an interest in kind of not in stopping the flow of refugees in particular into the Mediterranean. And we might think then about the kind of perhaps hidden agenda around refugees here. But I want to also think about the most recent resolution 2591 from this year, which does address women, peace and security in paragraphs 25, 26 and 27, almost the last few provisions in the resolution. And they are to some degree completely disconnected from the rest of the resolution. In particular, they don't mention the Maritime Task Force, but repeat sort of the standard framing of paragraphs in other resolutions on sexual exploitation and abuse committed by peacekeeping personnel, which is paragraph 25. Although in 26, gender is regarded as a cross-cutting issue and requires UNIFIL to account for gender considerations as a cross-cutting issue, gender is not spoken about in the rest of the resolution in relation to other issues. And then paragraph 27 calls for the full, effective and meaningful participation in all aspects of operations. Now, UNIFIL has 5% of its forces as women. So I think there's a gap between paragraph 7, which is about the Maritime Task Force and the handing over and transitioning responsibility of that to the Lebanese armed forces. And these last three resolutions, parts of the resolution 25, 26 and 27, which maybe are perhaps disconnected. So what are the European interests in UNIFIL's Maritime Task Force, and what role does this have in connecting to kind of border security and closing off refugee routes? And does this remind us that refugees are conspicuously absent from the women, peace and security agenda? And it might be something we also, Maritime Security asks us to ask of WPS. So I've got more to say on there, but I'm going to stop there and think about piracy and counterterrorism, and think about how in the 2021 debates on maritime security, the framing of piracy and counterterrorism doesn't speak to the WPS agenda, although we know, going back to 2242, the resolution from 2015, that the Council committed to bringing both counterterrorism and WPS together. We do have actually in some of the provisions from the African Union, the identification of, again, women as playing a role in the re-education or the education of future pirates away from piracy and into kind of better jobs. This locates the problem of piracy and social and cultural beliefs in the community, rather than the political and legal and economic structures that are well documented as kind of leading to piracy as a concern and an issue on the African continent. And then the fourth issue is environmental security, and how we might use environmental security to start a conversation that moves from state to human security to post-human security, not only framing environmental security as a component of maritime security, but a shift to maritime security that takes a kind of different approach to both Maritime Security Council's work and women, peace and security, taking serious the key threats to humans that rising oceans, ocean acidification and climate change might be understood through non-human subjects. So to develop a post-colonial and a post-human feminist account of maritime security, I argue it is necessary to hold prescient the dual impact of colonial privileges and the echoes of empire that constrain international law, and which have always deployed gender as a civilizing tool, and to ask about the consequences at the same time of elevating human lives over non-human lives and matter. And have argued that the recognition of women, peace and maritime security offers a space to capture not only the changing practice of the Security Council, but also a frame for privileging environmental security and for actively unraveling the complicity of international law in the trade routes of European explorers, colonizers and merchants. The Lome Convention, despite its fledgling support from states, offers a first template for perhaps thinking differently. This is, it should be clear by now, a marked departure from the human security lens that appears to be emerging within current maritime security discourse. The problem, however, for post-human laws is that ports, marine environments, ships and maritime infrastructures, let alone fish and the many marine organisms and creatures that depend on humans not destroying their habitats, cannot ratify a convention. Consequently, we see a post-colonial redux in the absence of a law for the sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Heathcote, for that fantastic lecture. So much to think about and so many different issues that you've covered there as well. So thank you. I'm very much looking forward to reading the final paper when it's done and out. So we have a couple of questions, and just a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. But I want to start off on one. It's a little bit long, but I'll try and shorten it. So the person thanks you for your talk. It's from an anonymous person, and they say that they've seen quite a bit of skepticism from critical international lawyers of the idea of using security discourse to think about environmental issues, and particularly recently in relation to ecocide. So the question is, well, there are a few questions. Does this just potentially extend securitization discourse into multiple areas? And therefore, what are the risks here in applying WPS to environmental issues through maritime security?
Thank you. I absolutely agree with you about the risks, and that's why I guess I wanted to track human security as being kind of a moment that is both a risk and potential. I think that people that were involved in kind of producing and developing the ideas around human security saw this as a pushback on the traditional version of state security. But what actually, in fact, we see is that human security becomes mobilized to use force, sanctions, and different kinds of military measures and other kinds of enforcement mechanisms against vulnerable communities in particular, and in a selective manner. So I think absolutely there's a risk. And I guess that's why my paper or my thoughts are not about, oh, well, let's bring WPS into maritime security. It's actually about actually how can we develop both, which I see as both absolutely crucial to thinking differently about international law, that we need to pay attention to maritime security. It's taken the council quite a while to think about it, and many of us don't think about maritime issues. I think there is an emergent kind of critical scholarship that is looking and paying attention. But let's not repeat what we already know is the risk and think differently both about WPS and maritime security. But I think that involves quite a lot of conversations and coming together.
Sorry, I didn't unmute there for some reason. Thanks so much. I actually have a related question, again, from somebody anonymous. So again, thank you for your great talk. And it's kind of related to what you were just speaking about, so I wanted to bring this up now. This question asks, given your critiques that you've raised around liberal feminism and essentialism in your talk, how can feminists find hope in the WPS agenda? And how can thinking about promoting women, peace and maritime security avoid these particular issues?
Yeah, thank you. This is what I spend most of my time thinking about, so I'm happy to answer it. Great question. So I think we do have to find hope. And the hope is that, WPS came about, and it didn't come about as one resolution that happened in 1325. It came about not only through continued kind of re-engagements with the council from different groups of feminist actors and different feminists working within the UN, but to have 10 resolutions that kind of subtly change and transform that agenda over time shows that these footholds exist. Now, I know I offer different critiques of WPS in different spaces, but that's not a discarding of WPS. I'm really interested in the way that Dioto has framed this as a foothold. And if we see it as a foothold, then that is the kind of hope that, well, actually, what can we use strategically around this? And I think that even what we have around WPS hasn't really been mobilized. I mean, in some spaces, it's been mobilized quite effective by different local feminist actors, but it's quite a lot of words, right? And when you look at which words from WPS emerge in situation-specific resolutions, such as the one for the Lebanese peacekeeping operation, you see three standard kind of provisions that emerge around participation, around sexual exploitation and abuse, the idea of calling for a cross-cutting issue, which is great, but then if it doesn't move outside of that paragraph, it's not clear what it does. But there's quite a lot of other stuff in WPS, right? So we can look at Resolution 1889 from 2009, which talks about social and economic dimensions of women, peace and security. Or we can look at 2242, which of course came about after the review in 2015 and had much more input than the previous resolutions between 2018 and 2013 from different feminist, transnational feminist networks. And I think there's quite a lot in that resolution that we could tap in and kind of travel further with. But of course, this paper is about saying, and how can we do even more, right? What more? And I think settling for the status quo would perhaps be like a problem. I think moving beyond that and thinking together what that might be would be great.
Great, thanks so much. I couldn't think of a better person to actually answer that question, so that was really helpful. Thank you. So we have a question that's come in actually from one of our students, but again, they don't want me to mention their name because they're being shy, but they say thank you. And they were wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how your frame for women, peace and maritime security might speak more to the refugee crisis. They said they'd never thought about this lens before and would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I actually influenced by something that I saw this morning. I mean, I was already thinking about this and I was trying to work out, you know, I felt a little bit uncomfortable seeing the EU being kind of involved in the handing over and the training of the Lebanese armed forces. And there are probably other people here that might know more about that than me. And then I saw that Ian Ovino has published in the New Yorker this morning and kind of expose of what's happening with the Libyan Coast Guard and the EU training and supplying of quite a lot of money and provisions, and the kind of absolutely horrendous conditions that the refugees that are being, you know, turned back into Libya are being held in. And, you know, it's this kind of denial of responsibility from Europe by pushing back into those coastal states. And so I wonder about what's playing out there in terms of constructing, not only constructing who doesn't belong in Europe, but also kind of creating legal apparatus that doesn't hold Europe responsible or is complicit in what's happening in terms, and they're absolutely horrific. If you look up the article in the New Yorker, you really will be, it really is quite a shocking realization. I guess perhaps we all knew, and I guess that's also something we might want to talk about, those of us that are in Europe at the moment. You know, how are we complicit by not actually paying attention? But I think there is already fantastic writing around the gendered and racialized dimensions of access to the sea in our histories. The role of exploring, that kind of was a privileged sets of individuals, the role of trade, which was always parallel and a part of the colonial project, and the role of colonialism itself, which obviously relied on, you know, naval powers, maritime power to actually access and occupy through a period of colonialization. And the gendered and racialized kind of dynamics that are constructed through that. And of course, law plays an important role in both constructing what belongs outside of humanity and who belongs in. So thinking through that, and of course, feminist posthumanism speaks to that as well. So I just encourage you to start reading about the histories of the ocean to think about refugee approaching refugee problems differently and seeing them as a continuity of past privileges to access the ocean. Perhaps the piece that I'm thinking about that I like to think through is Pereira's piece in the issue of Feminist Review on water. And I think that was always one of my starting points. But obviously, critical race feminists in the US who write on the histories of slavery and the oceans are also kind of very, very important pieces here as well.
Very much. So I think probably have time just about for one last question to squeeze it in. This one's a bit more specific, but I thought it was kind of interesting. So the person says, if I understand post-human feminism allows us to think about animals more, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more specifically about how this might help us to tackle the particular maritime security issue of illegal fishing. So I think there's probably a person working on illegal fishing here, some answers.
Oh, I'd love to be able to talk to you and think through that together. I mean, we know fishing is always framed not from the perspective of the fish, right? But I guess a post-human feminist or a post-human approach might ask us to ask not about the perspective of the fish, but about human fish dependencies. And actually, when you open up the question that way, you start thinking differently, both in terms of the huge human dependency on protein from fish in communities that are absolutely dependent on fish stock for life, right? And the tension between that and the idea of quotas and who has access to fish stock. And then I guess when we look to unreported, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, then we have to bring in a much more complex grid than just thinking about the criminalization of the actors that are responsible here, because that would keep us in a kind of human frame that thinks about good humans, bad humans, criminalization as an outcome, and then we'll solve the problem. But actually what creates those crimes are complex economic and also kind of cultural and both large scale macro economic inequalities and local inequalities. And I think the gender dynamic of that also plays out in if we look at who's involved in those industries. So it's probably a whole nother talk. And I'd love to talk to you if you follow up with me afterwards, especially if it's an area that you're working in, because we also know there's a gender dynamic in fishing industries. Women are more likely to be on the shore, men on the ships, but that doesn't mean that there's not a kind of interplay and a kind of specific kind of performance of gender as well. But that, I mean, that's a whole nother talk, so I better stop.
Thank you so much, Professor Heathcote. I think a lot of people would love to hear that other talk as well, and that really got me thinking a lot.
I need to write it first.
Yeah, that one next, maybe next time. But unfortunately, we are out of time, so we should probably end there. Yeah, I tried my best to select an array of questions on different topics, so hopefully that was fine. But just to say thank you so much for joining us in the lecture series. It was a real pleasure to have you. We're getting so many different comments through on the chat as well, saying thank you. So that's
it's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. So sorry I can't say hello to you all.
Yeah, but thank you everybody for coming, and take care. Have a good evening or day wherever you are in the world.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.